Hello and welcome to another Mass Medic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the organization. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the medtech industry in New England through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Today, we have a great webinar. We're talking about digital health projects and the turf war, if you will, role clarity between IT and R&D. This webinar is brought to you today by our friends at Full Spectrum. And before I turn it over to our moderator for today, I have just a few housekeeping notes to let you know about. The webinar is being recorded, so everyone who registered will receive a copy of this recording after to watch at their leisure. And we are going to have ample time for questions and answers. So as they occur to you, please feel free to put them at the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer those for you. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today. Adam Hussey is the Executive Vice President of Engineering from Full Spectrum, and he's going to be leading the conversation today. Adam.
Thank you. Welcome to today's webinar. Like Nicole mentioned, we'll be discussing a common challenge with digital health efforts. And unfortunately, it's about a turf war between IT and R&D. Before we get into details, let's do a couple of brief introductions. I've been, obviously I'm here at Full Spectrum now, but I've been in medical device and health information technology for about 20 years. I joined Full Spectrum about 2 years ago from Becton Dickinson's diabetes division, and before that, Medtronic's cardiac rhythm division. I'm joined by Dinendra Ramachandran. Dinendra, thank you for joining us today. Can you provide a brief introduction?
Yeah, thanks, and really glad to be part of this webinar. So I'm Dinendra Ramachandran. I'm the Vice President of Digital Solutions at Convertech. We are, I would say, a mid-sized UK-based med device company focused on 4 business units: advanced wound care, ostomy care, continence care, and infusion care. I've been in the med device space for nearly 30 years, starting my career in Philips ultrasound, and then most recently, prior to Convertech, as a Smith & Nephew, part of their robotic surgery division.
All right, thank you, Dinendra. So nearly all medtech organizations, excuse me, that we speak to are making significant investments into digital health. What does that mean? One description of digital health from the FDA is digital health technologies use computing platforms, connectivity, software, and sensors for healthcare and related uses. Many initiatives are labeled digital health, but there's a broad array of solutions that fit the definition. The problem we're going to talk about today is the likely conflict that arises between the IT and R&D organizations around delivering and managing a digital health solution. This conflict is very common since both IT and R&D organizations see problems that they can solve. What tends to happen is product, which is typically developed by R&D, begins to intersect with business systems. This intersection can be very powerful and could provide a significant competitive advantage, but this integration must be managed carefully to maximize the opportunity. First, let's talk about the historical view of each organization. So, Dinendra, can you help me out kind of just describing the general view of what does an IT organization focus on historically versus an R&D organization?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will probably share this context. Traditionally, IT has come from the side of, hey, I provide you laptops, I give you access to email, I allow you to kind of manage your ERP type systems. The pure hardware, software, maintenance type support, getting your IT issues resolved and all those things. That's what the traditional view of IT is. And then R&D typically is focused on product development, right? And especially when it comes to categories of products that would not deem as digital health, they were focused on, getting your regulatory approval done, getting your process development done, and all those things, and getting approved and following the QMS in that sense, right? So quite different mindset that's there both within IT and R&D. And now it maybe seem like mixing a little bit of oil and water in that sense too.
Yeah, it's a good point. And a lot of overlap occurs as they have more and more software systems that start to look alike from a technology perspective. I mean, one area of intersection is around really where business systems and product start to intersect. Dinendra, can you maybe think of an example where these systems would potentially intersect that maybe they would not have 10 or 15 years ago, but is becoming more and more common?
Yeah, I think if you look and see, a patient's needs are diverse, right? If you look and see the continuum of care that patients go through, they need a wide variety of things. They, of course, needs to be make sure that we need to take up their therapy. Now, if it's a diabetes care type system, you need to make sure that diabetes delivery is happening in that system. But that's not just the only need from a patient perspective. They need that orders to be provided. Infusion pumps, infusion sets, wide variety of things in that regard too. They've got emotional needs and all those things. So when we talk of digital health, it is looking at all these aspects of things that a patient needs beyond just therapeutics, looking at order supply chain management, looking at emotional needs, and all the nutritional needs, educational needs. That is really what the needs from a patient perspective in that sense too.
And Dinendra, would you say that it's really one of the sources there might be more of the consumerization of healthcare, that patients are more and more involved in their care and they expect more of a full consumer experience where they can interact with the company that they're buying from more directly than when the healthcare provider is between them and the manufacturer or the provider?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as a lot of us would like a single stop shop for solutions, right? They don't want to go to one supplier for my med devices, another supplier for, getting my therapy done, another supplier for getting my supplies done and all those things. If I can get everything done in totality from one place, but not only that, everything is connected from an information standpoint, right? There's no gaps in information, right? How much did I use from a therapy standpoint? How much supplies do I need? If everything can be joined together to provide the totality of care for a patient, it is really a seamless experience from a patient perspective.
Right. Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about the technical issue. When I think about software, I tend to, in my head, break it into three tiers. At the lowest level, you're talking about embedded software, firmware, FPGA. This is cases where you've got limited memory, real-time control, maybe even power consumption as a significant consideration. We don't typically see much conflict there relative to IT and R&D. But at the mid-level, we have mobile and desktop applications. So in that case, real-time tends to go away. Memory is probably less of a scarce resource. This is an area where the IT and R&D organizations both will have capabilities. Mobile application may already be part of the product, and the IT group may have an existing mobile application, that is helping the sales team monitor ordering or inventory levels with a customer, for example. So this is a case where we've got really two sets of technologies applied to two different organizations, applied very differently, but certainly a case where we're seeing there's capabilities on both the IT and R&D organizations to deliver that particular technology. At the highest level, there is cloud and enterprise applications. These applications are very abstracted from the hardware they run on and communicate with the user over a network. This is where we typically see the most conflict between IT and R&D. Really, both organizations have likely invested significantly in building capabilities here. And obviously now they've invested significantly in growing their organization relative to cloud and enterprise development. They want to be able to utilize those capabilities to the fullest extent possible. So now that we've really covered the areas of conflict, let's discuss some of the differences from an execution perspective. So Dinendra, I'll ask you to jump in here again. Can you kind of describe some of the process differences that exist between how R&D might execute versus how IT might execute, even if the technologies might be the same between the organizations?
Yeah, I think a great point, right? I think one of the things is, IT typically has got a stage gate process, right? R&D has got a stage gate process. The gates are very different. The meanings are very different in that sense, right? R&D typically is very QMS-centric in that sense too, right? IT is very business-centric and making sure cybersecurity is checked off, privacy is checked off, and all those things in that regard too, right? So I think now you're trying to see that how do both of these teams works towards creating a customer-centric solutions that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing in that sense too, right? So this is where the process alignment is needed and all those things, so that everybody's working towards the same goal and objective, and they're somewhat cadence aligned in that sense too.
That's a great point, Andrew. What about risk? That's another area where I think if you talk to both an IT professional or R&D professional, they're gonna hear risk and have a particular picture in their head. How would those pictures tend to differ, at least generally speaking?
No, it's a great point. I think like product risk is not exactly what an IT person would know, right? They know project risk, but they may not know what a product risk in that sense too. What do I mean by product risk? Is a lot of us will be in the med device space. We need to do hazard analysis. We need to do DFMEAs. We need to do UFMEAs. We need to do PFMEAs and all those things. These are all alien terminologies when it comes to IT. Okay? So now, as you can see, when we have two teams working together and one person says, hey, I need to do something like a DFMEA, they have no idea what they're talking about in that system, right? So this is where the process alignment needs to occur so that both of them are working towards the same goals and objectives, but allow some process difference in that sense, right? And all those things. Right? And integration is very important, right? How do you do integration testing, for example? If these two things need to come together, the integration testing is very crucial to make sure that customer-centric solutions are creating the right value for the patient, for the clinicians, and for the company itself in that sense too.
Yeah, another area to talk about might be the operations side of it as well, where the R&D organizations historically, they're developing a product and then really handing it over to a support team and a sales organization to execute and operationalize, whereas an IT organization might really likely is to maintain the operational control over that asset. And this is an area that I see where the IT organization comes with a lot of assets in terms of not only the capabilities to monitor your cloud infrastructure 24/7, but also being able to support it. If something happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, someone has to get up and potentially respond to that, which is something that's likely out of the comfort zone of somebody within the R&D organization. So I see that as another area where the IT organization has something very valuable to bring to the table, and that is just not only the organizational capabilities to do the support, but that insight in what results in a potential support issue from a technical execution perspective helps inform how they develop. Like, how do I make sure that I can diagnose a problem at 3 o'clock in the morning, versus it really being more of a clear handoff to a separate support organization. I don't know if you have anything more to add on that, Dinendra, but that's another area I think there's a significant difference from a process perspective.
No, I think it's a great point, right? Because I think R&D typically is built from thinking, build and sustain. And they will build and they go to what is called as typically called sustaining engineering mode. When you're creating cloud-based assets, when you're creating mobile assets and all those things, it is cloud and making sure that operationally everything is running, right? Typically, IT will have an ARO organization, an application run organization. That's a very alien terminology when it comes to R&D. What do you mean by running the applications? What do you mean by uptime? What do you mean by SLAs? If I get an issue, I'm going to respond within, if it's a priority one issue, I'm going to respond within 24 hours in that sense, right? So this is where IT is part of IT's DNA, but R&D is a little bit like this is, I don't even understand what you're talking in that sense, right? So this is really, IT has got a lot of expertise in that area, and we need to make sure as we're creating digital health solutions, uptime, SLAs, I got a problem, I got a cybersecurity issue. How do you make sure we jump in and can resolve those issues very quickly? That's a key in that solution.
Yeah, one other area that really kind of builds on the operations side is is really around the pace of upgrades, right? I think particularly in higher class or higher risk devices, you want to avoid upgrades at all possible, right? They're expensive, they're difficult to administer. Whereas in the IT space, there's an expectation for much quicker turnarounds in terms of if something's broken, can we fix it in an hour or a day, versus a more traditional product which you're releasing into the market. You might look at your complaint data in aggregate once a quarter, and then be scheduling any resolutions to any problems identified through that process over the course of the next quarters or potentially even years through future product upgrades. Versus, an IT organization might see, I need to get a fix out for the problem that showed up at 3 a.m. I'm going to try to get a fix out before noon tomorrow. So really around the pace and how your quality system is potentially set up to be able to respond to that pace. One might see that as a potentially a field corrective action on the R&D side if you're doing a software patch. So really making sure that your quality system on the R&D side is really structured to be able to deal with the expected pace of change that goes along with something in the digital health space versus a box that you're delivering to a customer and then upgrading very, very rarely. So another area that I see that could potentially challenge how, or at least provide an opportunity where both organizations would be able to work well together.
It's a great point, right? I think when we talk of software type systems, many have got cybersecurity issues. I think FDA is already thinking of guidances. For example, how do you respond and deploy a solution within 30 days, for example, right? Now, you can't, if you say that you need 6 months for a regulatory assessment, well, that's not going to fly, right?
Yeah.
So how do you separate out your system so a cybersecurity issue can be quickly deployed and has got a faster pace regulatory assessment that gets done in that sense, right? And secondly, nowhere is people creating software totally from top to end. It's using a lot of third-party solutions, right? In the R&D world, you talk of these as SOOP or software of unknown provenances too. How do you monitor these solutions? If there's a breach and a SOOP component, how do you deploy things very quickly in that regard too?
Yeah. No, another sort of real practical implementation of that is really advancements from a DevOps perspective. If you've made significant investments in DevOps, that is a different sort of a differentiator in your ability to respond quickly. I completely agree with you about there is no patience for, well, I'm gonna work on this cybersecurity issue in my next product release, which might be 6, 12, 24 months away. It is about being able to rapidly push small changes through a very efficient development system, which DevOps could be part of the solution towards managing that, so that I can make this small change, get it into the hands of customers very, very quickly, but not increasing any risk or creating any complications with the FDA because not having done enough, applied enough rigor to that release process.
Yeah, even DevOps, I think there is potential for misalignment there again between R&D and IT, because when we talk of building an SBOM, right, a software bill of materials, it is not something that IT typically knows what that means, right? But as the FDA is mandating, we create SBOM type situations. How do you have your DevOps automatically build these SBOM type things, and it's part of your DevOps chain, and all those things need to be built in that sense, right? And then non-functional requirements. IT typically doesn't know what non-functional requirements are. But if you spin that off and say, hey, I need it to be reliable, I need it to be scalable, I need it to be observable, and now you're having the same conversation in that sense.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about the technology. Again, I mentioned earlier that the kind of that mid-tier where you're talking about mobile and desktop applications is really a common area for the conflict potentially to show up. And let's just say, for example, that an organization was needed to build a mobile application that would help a patient manage their medication, whether that be strictly adherence or whether that be just tracking, have I taken my medication? When both organizations look at that problem, they likely see a problem they can both solve. But given that kind of the bounds of that example, how would you see IT and R&D potentially collaborating on something like that?
No, it's a great point, right? And typically, to even make it more confusing, sometimes it starts off, let's say, because typically marketing will say, hey, can you build a small app for me that does this? Okay. And IT will say, yeah, absolutely, I will build it in that sense, right? And they will deploy it. Suddenly, they add features and functionality that people realize it becomes a software as a medical device, SAMD. Okay. Now, what do you do in that situation, right? IT has said, hey, I've built this and maintain it. What else do you need me to make an SAMD? Okay. Well, we may need to start from the scratch in that sense, right? So I think that's where I think there's a little bit of kind of education that needs to occur and see that, okay, it is not just React.js. It is not just creating a Java application. As a lot of us who are in the med device space know that writing the code is probably 30% of the effort. The other 70% of the effort is documentation, process, all those things in that regard, right? So sometimes IT needs to be educated. There are a lot more things you need to do for building an SCMD type devices that goes beyond writing code and doing some technology related things in that regard.
No, that's a great point. And I think that another area where the collaboration would be able to help in that example might be leveraging an existing single sign-on infrastructure. Back to the consumerization of healthcare. If you're interacting with one particular manufacturer and you've got to have three or just generally multiple sets of login information to be able to order supplies or utilize a medication adherence app, it's quite frustrating as a consumer. So there may be an asset within IT that could be leveraged very, very quickly and accelerate the overall program and frankly avoid reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, and that's what customers demand too, right, Adam? Because customers say, like, just basically, I don't want to log into one app with a certain sign-on for doing digital therapy. And I don't want to sign on to another app with a different sign-on for ordering my supplies. I want that single sign-on so that I can do everything in the same app in that sense too, right? So if you talk of Okta or Azure B2C and all those things, can it be leveraged at the enterprise-wide while keeping the architecture separation so that your digital therapeutics part of your solutions is segregated from your IT and enterprise type systems in that sense too?
No, another area relative to just this example would be the kind of back to process around segmentation of risk. The components that you may leverage from your IT group, you'd want to make sure that those are you're leveraging components that are not in any way responsible for a scenario related to patient risk, versus being able to control and containerize any, like if the solution potentially was helping you adjust your medication by making seeing what you've taken or having you ask some survey questions, that decision would likely carry some risk with it, and you want to have that isolated from your general IT infrastructure, which wouldn't fall under the regulation of the FDA, but certainly like a decision like that, potentially would, depending upon obviously the risk associated with it.
Absolutely, fully agree. Yeah.
Okay, well, talking a little bit about kind of where do we go from a solution perspective? Like many organizational problems, at least part of the solution is around well-defined roles and responsibilities. The fundamental conflict here is that the two organizations see how they could address the need. Digital health is a team sport. R&D organizations are used to collaborating with external functions like manufacturing, marketing, et cetera. Likewise, IT organizations are in the business of collaborating with all departments to develop solutions to address business problems. Now let's talk about trying to precisely define the role for each organization within your digital health initiative. The real question is, where do you start? So Dinendra, you come into a new organization and you're seeing this conflict. How would you start the process of defining roles and responsibilities against an R&D organization that you don't know and an IT organization that you don't know, but you need to get to a point where you know what they can do and understand where and how they should collaborate?
Yeah, I think if I had a blank sheet of paper, I think I would start off, and I'm not saying there's always the legacy you got to deal with. And organization changes that we got, and having done this in few organizations, I've got my battle scars in that sense too, right? But I think one of the things is, how do you use something in an agile framework? And when I talk of agile, really a scaled agile framework, so that everybody is working towards that common goal, using an agile terminology of a common backlog, product backlog in that sense, right? Product backlog may have features and user stories that is segregated on, let's say, ordering supplies. Second may be related to delivering therapy in that sense too. Now you're working towards that common backlog. You got quarterly planning that is going on to say, okay, these are the features we need to deliver in the next quarter. What does IT as an agile team, a scrum team, a sprint team needs to deliver in terms of feature and functionality to meet that next quarterly milestone? What does R&D need to do similarly in terms of digital therapeutics to provide that in that sense, right? And there are certain areas of kind of overlap. Okay, single sign-on, for example. One team needs to own it, deliver it, and other teams need to use it in that sense, right? So there are cadence alignment that needs to occur in that sense, right? So Agile can be your great friend, or scaled Agile framework can be a great friend when it comes to kind of operationalize and make out your come forward with the great ways of working in that sense too, right? And this is what I've seen successfully at multiple organizations, is that people are adopting the safe approach, which each team within IT and R&D owning a different Scrum team, but are cadence aligned in that sense too.
That's a really good point. And I think one other area is in just getting started is really assessing the assets of both organizations. We already talked in the last example about single sign-on. If that already exists, there's some work you don't have to do in theory. If you already have within your IT group a multi-channel communication system, so you can get text messages or emails or phone calls out, it might be something to be able to leverage. And part of that assessment would have to be looking at some of the service level agreements you have across those systems. If you're the multi-channel communication is going to be something used for just notices around the use of your product. It probably doesn't need to be 24/7. You could probably get away with a lower SLA. But if that same communication would be to be notifying either your physician or the patient of a potential medical emergency, then a 5x24/7 solution wouldn't satisfy the risks associated with missing a potential emergency on a weekend. So really it's looking at those assets on both sides and understanding whether or not the assets directly apply all the way down to the SLA. And on the R&D side, it's really looking at, what are the talents of that organization look like? You've had an organization completely focused on the lowest tier that I described earlier in terms of embedded development or firmware development. Asking that organization to try to jump into the cloud space quickly might be a recipe for disaster just due to the differences in technology. But the R&D organization likely has a really strong handle on things like 62304. So how do I create the right documentation to be able to satisfy the FDA, not only so that I have success from a submission standpoint, but also so that I've leveraged the different classes within 62304 so that I'm not overburdening my overall effort. I don't know if there's other areas you can think of, Dinendra, in terms of areas where you may be able to get some immediate leverage from either IT or R&D.
Yeah, I think great points, Adam. I think beyond that, one thing I would add is the enterprise and product architecture, because I think the architecture is going to give you the right level of integration points. It's going to give you the right level of isolation. If you don't have the isolations, everything may end up being deemed as a medical device. So when we did this in a cardiac defibrillator company and we were using SAP for getting the ordering of the supplies, the segregation is not initially done very adequately. And even the FDA came back and said, why is that? Because now the SAP system problem can bring your defibrillator down to its heels, and it's not provide therapy in that sense too, right? So that architecture segregation needs to be very, very well done. Your enterprise architecture cannot be a part of your design history file, but it needs to be part of your business process. But the product architecture needs to be a part of your DHF in that sense, right? So agreeing upon the integration points, making sure there's the right level of isolation so the risks are minimized, that's another key point to keep in mind in that sense too.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think what you're talking about really highlights the need for strong systems engineering, right?
Yeah.
It's system allocation. How are you compartmentalizing risk? How are you making sure that frankly you'll be able to test these solutions in the end, especially as you're connecting multiple systems, the need to stand up the full chain of systems to be able to say, yes, this thing works, after first release and after I've made a series of changes, can be really challenging if you don't plan for that from the get-go.
Yeah. The other thing I will also add is I think certain terminologies that may be more okay on the IT side of things may not apply when you're developing a medical device. For example, recently I was talking to one of my engineers who came from the IT background. That person was saying, let's do blue-green deployments. It is okay. But when you talk of verification and validation, all those things, the rollback mechanism, how you do blue-green deployments needs to be thought through very carefully so that somebody is not thinking of this as almost like a recall type situation where you deployed something and it does not work out and you're kind of pulling it back in that sense, right? So kind of it's a very important nuance, but blue-green deployment, how does verification, validation gets done so that you're not exposing your customers to an adulterated product. These are important terminologies to keep in mind in that sense.
No, it's a good point. If you're going to keep your system live, you need to be able to represent that each stage in a transition, you run through a test scenario to ensure that even if that stage is only temporary, that in that small period of time, that you're not exposing a potential risk to a patient. So it's really about managing that full life cycle and ensure it's covered from a test perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what about communication and just escalation? I know when I say communication, I don't mean the software communicating with or pieces of software communicating. I mean the teams communicating. And when an issue happens, where do we go with that? What are your thoughts on how do you set up a situation where something broke in the ecosystem? It could be on the IT side, it could be on the product side, it could be it could be because a patient didn't follow the instructions, right? So it's pretty complicated to figure that out. But how would you, what approaches would you use to sort of manage the complexities that go along with that?
Yeah, I think there is communication that is needed prior to production deployment, and there is communication that is needed after production deployment. And each of them has got different level of sensitivity in that sense too, right? So prior to production deployment, the agile, the scaled agile framework again can be kind of quite a great ally in that sense, right? How did the Scrum occurs? How did the Scrum of Scrum occurs? How does quarterly planning occurs in that sense? How do you have integration planning, some of those things? How do you have team retrospectives that can transcend IT and R&D in that sense, right? So this is a great way of doing things. Once you deploy into production, and especially if there's an issue in production at that point, that's a whole different nuance in that sense too. Because typically complaints go to quality first, because they need to monitor the complaints in that sense. But then quality needs to say how to triage certain things. If it is somebody has forgot their email or their password needs to get reset, it needs to go to the IT side of the team in that sense too. If it is really a product defect that needs to get triaged, it needs to go to a separate team, maybe a level 2 team in that sense too, who needs to kind of discern and say, where is the problem? Is it on the IT infrastructure side of things, or is it really on the digital therapeutics side of software side of things in that sense too? So creating that tiered level 1, level 2, level 3, understanding very clearly how the handoff occurs needs to be very clearly done, because otherwise you got something in production and your ability to respond is really an issue and becomes a customer facing issue in that sense too.
One other area that we haven't talked too much about is around just architecture and design. I know that's related to some of the systems engineering activities we've already talked about, but this is an area where when we think about architecture, we always think about them in viewpoints, right? So almost looking at it through a zoom lens. First is the physical. So there's a device here and a device here, and they communicate. And then the next level down would be more of a logical viewpoint. So breaking up what does the software look like inside of each physical device. And then it goes on forward to the data viewpoint, sort of a state viewpoint, et cetera, et cetera. One of the viewpoints that I've added in the past that has been really helpful in managing this conflict is really an organizational viewpoint over a system architecture, and really being able to draw organizational boundaries across the different components of an overall ecosystem. So it becomes very clear who owns what. And then that really helps you start off with some of the additional documentation that you need, which would be system interface documents. And that ends up becoming very much like contracts. It's a contract you exchange with one side or the other, depending upon who's sort of authoring the interface, and then that contract has to be respected. But really where the contracts are needed is something that you have to define in the architecture very, very clearly. It also, I think, helps with the turf war because it really gives everybody a level of ownership, and so they can understand that level of ownership, as they're kicking off a new initiative. I don't know if you have any more thoughts or comments on that one, Dinendra?
No, I think it's a great, right? Especially as a lot of us start moving to microservices based architecture, right? Define the microservices and the APIs very clearly, right? Those are your contracts. So you know who owns those microservices, what team owns that microservices, what are the APIs to ingress the data, egress the data. Is very clearly laid out in that sense. Those contracts are very important in that sense too. And then you touched on a very important point, right? Data, right? Data architecture becomes very important and actually becomes a lot more important as we get into the world of AI, right? And AI needs data, it's data hungry, that's 80% of the problem. You need clean data in that sense, right? How do you have a great data architecture? How do you have a great data governance? That's really important in that sense, right? When I did this in my previous life, and we were integrating with one of the order chain supply management system, the data quality that we were getting was really not clean data. And unfortunately, we had not built a great system that cleansed the data before we consumed it in that sense too, right? And how do you ensure that the data architecture is very clear, the data governance is very clear? How do you make sure you've got right level of cleansing stages? And when you come into the world of AI, how do you ensure that this data can be used for, let's say, building medical devices in that sense?
Yeah, and that very much flows over into to testing, right? So another area would be potentially simulation, so that if you have two systems communicating, and on one side of it, it's your ERP system, that if that system were to be down or whatever the case may be, that there's some level of simulation, so at least you can exercise the interfaces. What you wouldn't want to have is a situation where you can't release a product because one of the dependent systems is unable to be unavailable during a testing cycle. So being able to have, is there a way for me to be able to simulate something else that development doesn't have to stop to wait for another system to come back online? So being able to, invest in simulation so that you don't create that friction during the development process.
No, absolutely, 100%. Right? Especially when it comes to when we talk of testing, right? There's pre-prod testing, there's development environment, QA environment, pre-prod, prod, and all these things. Sometimes you don't get real data, you need to get synthetic data. Is your synthetic data adequately representative of the production data? And that's it, right? The organization needs to think very adequately and make sure that pre-production testing is adequately representative of what's going to happen in the production environment in that sense.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Those different levels of environments, there may not be an identical match on both sides. I know I ran into a situation where, we had a development, a test, an acceptance, and a production environment. So 4 environments on the product side, and we were interacting with SAP, and there was only test and production, and test was even pretty tightly controlled. So we only were able to connect it at the acceptance environment. Well, if you introduced a bug as a developer and you've got a mature sort of promotion process, it's going to take a while for that bug to be promoted to a point where you can learn that it's a bug.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That simulation helps you a lot in something like that.
Yeah.
So we'd also you've talked about SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework. I think that's a great tool to align multiple functions within an organization around developing a product and developing to a common goal. From an execution standpoint, how would you manage sort of just the accumulation of work in a safe environment? What would you use to sort of keep track of all the work happening on both sides?
You got to monitor your technical debt, right? And I think your technical debt, you don't want to get out of hand. You need to make sure that you're giving capacity to the team to burn down technical debt. It cannot be just all features. And this is a balancing act that every organization has to do. I think sometimes you got to say that 70% of my capacity is doing feature development that's going to be customer facing. Maybe 30% is going kind of burning down technical debt. And I'm just giving some guidelines. And it may vary based on the context and all those things in that regard too. The bottom line is you just can't let the technical debt build up, because now you got to say that this system is so obsolete right? You need to throw it away and start from scratch in that sense. And that becomes very expensive. But monitoring your technical debt in your backlog to make sure it's not growing too much is a really needs to be an organization muscle that gets built into the organization in that sense too.
Yeah, and you use the word backlog. I think that's really important that you have a common backlog in that scenario so that all parties involved can really see and participate, even if that participation is just a series of questions. If there's work happening on the other side of an interface that at least you have visibility to, you may be able to talk the other side out of doing something that may negatively affect how your system's performing, such as being able to see that maybe an interface that you expect to be called, once a minute is going to suddenly be called, 6 times per second, and realize, oh my goodness, that's going to overflow the boat. So being able to just have visibility on what work is happening on each side of the interface is really important to avoid some of those expensive problems to learn late in the process.
Absolutely.
Okay. One other, I think the last area we'll cover here before we turn it over to questions is talking a little bit more about support and, a complaint. A complaint means something very different, I think, on both sides of the equation. On the R&D side, that's more used to FDA regulated complaints, has a very specific meeting with the FDA, versus a typical support issue or that might come in. I forgot my password, or I can't log in. Anything sort of generic like that may or may not be a complaint. And really educating both sides on how to manage those, because a complaint or a support issue might come in on the from an IT system, but might actually result in a complaint with the overall product. I don't know if you have other thoughts there, Nendra.
No, I think it's a great point, right? I think we need to look at it from that lens, absolutely, right? How do you ensure that these complaints are looked at from a standpoint of what is the product level complaint in that sense too, right? And the other thing also to keep in mind is as we look at connected products, and the connected products, you're getting defects that is not even reported by your customers, but is showing up in your connected health system. Let's say you got your insulin device or something, and we're finding when we're looking at the scanning of the logs, we find there's a defect that's cropping up. Nobody is to complain, but if somebody were to look at the data in your connected system, you can see that the defects are there, right? So some of it is complaint that somebody's picking up the phone and making a call, but sometimes it's looking at certain latent complaints that is showing up in your system and making sure you're monitoring and adequately kind of proactively addressing it in that system. Because one of the discussions I had within my QA organization is, hey, that's a complaint that we know about it. It's a latent complaint, but the system knows about it. It's not a human being is not looking at it, but we need to have a human being look at it in that sense too.
No, that's a great point, because I think there are a lot of situations where again, the power of combining the business systems and your product is you get that phone call into support and you hear the complaint about the bad experience that they potentially had. But then if you can correlate that to a message or something in a log file, that becomes a really great opportunity for you to look across. A lot of people that may have had that bad experience didn't decide to call support. So this problem, which may be hurting you in the back end because you've got less patients wanting to use your therapy because of these issues, may not be showing up as complaints. So your ability to get that one complaint and try to correlate it to other events that are happening in the field certainly allow you to be more proactive in terms of either addressing it in the product or providing guidance, labeling changes, et cetera, to the patient to help them avoid that bad situation that's causing them to call into support. So really gives you an opportunity to really pull the signal out of the noise relative to any customer calls or customer complaints.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that's everything we had to go through. I think we can turn it over now to Nicole to bring forward any questions that came through from a Q&A perspective.
Great conversation. Thanks so much. As a reminder, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function and we will ask them to this group of experts. We did get one in, Adam. So can you give an example of one of the most significant challenges you've experienced kind of when working between R&D and IT on a digital health project?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think the most significant challenge that I've seen is when you have significant legacy systems. So you've got big systems on both sides that all have technical debt, that all have predetermined design decisions, and these systems were not designed to work together. So not only are you working with sort of managing the conflict between two organizations, but you're managing the conflict in the context of people trying to connect something that was never designed to talk to each other. So you both have an organizational conflict as well as you have a technical conflict that is not easy to resolve. So I don't know, Dinendra, if you have an example that's similar to that was particularly challenging in your past experiences.
Yeah, I think it is kind of similar to how we started off the conversation, right? The process conflict, right? I think process conflicts, when we talk of DFMEAs, PFMEAs, and all those things, the IT side of the world sometimes is not very familiar with these terminologies, right? And when we talk of verification and validation, as people who are in the med device space knows, for example, when you're doing verification and validation, you put not for human use on your product label, right? It's clearly marked as not for human use. When we deploy to production, somebody needs to flip that bit, right? It needs to be needed for human use. So typically, IT may be the team who's doing that production deployment, and now you need to make sure that the processes in terms of flipping the bit is very clearly understood between R&D and IT. Otherwise, it becomes a customer-facing problem in that sense. Right? So this is, to me, is an important thing to keep in mind, is that process alignment between R&D and IT needs to be very robust so that nothing slips through the cracks in that sense.
All right, thanks, Dinendra.
We do have another question from the perspective of the final, excuse me, final product or solution. What can an organization hope to gain from a healthy collaboration between IT and R&D? Again, in terms of the end product, what are the risks of an unhealthy relationship?
I think the primary gain that I see is speed. We've talked about several examples today, and we're all in the same game. We're all playing the time to market game. First one to market wins. And in this case, being able to again leverage the capabilities of both organizations efficiently allows you to get really the benefits of the speed that you historically get out of an IT organization with the control that you get out of a medical device R&D organization, and trying to align those two really allows you to get your product or get your solution to market much quicker. The downside of the conflict is that you could be paying the price for years. If you haven't well documented your interface, you're going to see regressions regularly. You're also likely to delay your first release. So really being efficient here is important for both the first release, but also making sure that the cost of your digital health initiative is not prohibitively expensive in the post-market space.
I think if I may add to that, I think absolutely right. What Adam touched is important. I think we also have to keep in mind why are we doing what we do. We do this for our patients. We do this for our clinicians. Clinicians don't know R&D and IT. They want a solution. They want a solution that works very seamlessly in that sense too, right? And they want to make sure that they don't have to kind of coordinate between two different applications, two different apps, two different systems to get what is needed in that sense, right? Ordering supplies, this is digital therapy. Everything needs to work very seamlessly in that sense. So the potential for a company that collaborates very well is to create delightful customer-facing solutions. And the flip side of this is, if it is not working very well, we'll have a fragmented system that is not going to create that very delightful experience in that sense.
Thank you. We have another question here. Do you anticipate new departments forming that are a result of this shift in the product types? Some form of combination of IT and R&D, or are they going to remain separate?
Great question.
That's a really good. Sorry, Dinendra, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking to it. I think some teams are experimenting with this, where they're creating a digital health organization. I don't think that's a panacea in that sense too, because still you need IT to kind of maintain, let's say, the infrastructure on a cloud piece in that sense too. Siloing it out totally is really not possible. SAP needs to be maintained by IT. CRM needs to be maintained by IT. Single sign-on may need to be maintained by IT in that sense too. So creating a separate carved-out organization may not make sense. I think going back to how you have an architecture that is service-based with clear APIs may still be the direction that we need to work towards in that sense too. I don't know, Adam, do you have any thoughts on that regard?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. I've heard of a few organizations spinning up a corporate center of excellence around generally software development or generally around digital health. But some of the practices we've talked about today are still needed. To the point you made, Dinendra, you're putting this other organization, but now that organization is sitting between IT and R&D. So in some ways, you've really magnified the need for some of the practices that we've talked about today, because now you're potentially in a position where you're managing interfaces on two sides. So, so it is. I'm seeing it happen. Obviously variable success there, but you still have to take some of these approaches to make sure that that the overall system continues to work. To Nendra's point earlier, the customer doesn't care which department within the organization you're working with. They just want a solution that works end to end and reliably.
Yeah, good thoughts. We don't have any other questions from the audience at this time, so I would like to give Adam and Dinendra one last chance if they'd like to have any closing remarks. Adam, one thing that I think might be helpful for people on the webinar, if they would like to follow up with Full Spectrum, what's the best way? How can they reach you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously we're available on multiple platforms. So you can hit us up on our LinkedIn page. Otherwise, when we conclude this, we can provide contact information for myself as well as the business development folks within Full Spectrum. So there's multiple ways, and we can get that out with this webinar.
Wonderful. Dinendra, any closing remarks?
No, I think we're a small group of people working on something very important. We're all patients, or will be patient at some point in time. Just keep the patient in mind, right? These are all important things that we need to solve in that sense too. But as you go and start walking the life of a patient, these are important problems that we need to solve in that regard too, right? So let's figure out and see how to collaborate, foster that collaboration, create that customer-centric view, and build that sense of urgency in that sense.
Yeah, wonderful closing. Thank you so much. I think that's all why we are all in this industry. So thank you again for your time today. Thank you for those who joined us live. Really appreciate you coming and getting this expertise today. Thank you to Full Spectrum for sponsoring today's conversation. We can't put on these great conversations and presentations without support from sponsors like you. So thank you very much. I would encourage you to take a look at massmedic.com/events and see all the other great events we have coming up. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Adam. Talk soon. Bye.